When a murder's committed, it's always a race against time, to find the truth, to separate fact from fiction, to catch the killer, and to make sure that justice is served. But what happens when the truth vanishes with the victim? I'm Dr. Richard Shepherd, and I've spent my entire career as a forensic pathologist performing nearly 23,000 autopsies, including on some of the most high-profile cases of recent times. I've learned that the dead don't hide the truth, and they never lie. Through me, you'll be hearing directly from the victim.
From a state-of-the-art laboratory with groundbreaking technology that uses digitally scanned sample bodies,
I'll be investigating a series of intriguing murders where, from the victims' bodies, I'll be revealing to you the truth behind those horrific crimes. On the 1st of July 1997 in Oakland, California, police found the dismembered body of a woman.
the house had been attacked by arsonists just 2 weeks earlier. But who was the victim? And what could her body reveal about its own death?
East Oakland, not a bad neighborhood. A lot of people had been in that neighborhood for many years. You know, there were a lot of kids in the neighborhood, and a lot of people seemed to know each other.
Residential neighborhood, but like everything else, it had its share of problems.
It was predominantly African American in what I would call a working class neighborhood.
But on the 15th of July 1997, a grim discovery was made.
I was the crime scene investigator on the scene, the primary one that was in the field. I was called in the morning and was told to respond to the address on 50th Avenue in Oakland. And I was there to search for evidence and a body. The K-9 units went in first and searched the basement as well as the home.
It wasn't long before they were on the scent.
I get to the scene and I'm trying to get my equipment out of the car. The guys were yelling for me to hurry up and come on in the house. So I just grabbed my camera and ran up into the house, and they took me into the kitchen area and propped open a floor freezer. It was very dark inside, and I reached into the freezer to see what was in there, and it appeared to be plastic, like garbage bags. From one of the garbage bags, I could feel an arm and elbow. Told everybody to be quiet and be still, and I tried to feel for a pulse, but there was none. We secured that area, and I asked everybody to leave because now I've got a dead body in a freezer box. We had to figure out how we were going to transport the body to the coroner's office. A few discussions occurred, and it was finally decided that we would transport the body fully and completely inside the freezer box. We had to get a truck, we had to get a dolly, we had to get some duct tape because I wanted to make sure that the box was secured. I was there at the coroner's office, and I photographed the beginning of the autopsy. The body wasn't burned. It was starting to decompose, but her legs were cut off. Her torso was cut. There were 4 body parts that came out of those bags.
The body parts were found in the home of local woman Stevie Allman, so they assumed she was the victim. But they needed to be sure.
The first job of a pathologist is to identify the body. The body goes through a number of stages after death, which aren't particularly time-dependent, but they usually start with discoloration of the skin, then blister formation, then bloating and liquefaction. And all of these changes are environmentally dependent.
You can see here on this sample body on the digital table how rigor mortis occurs after death when the muscles stop receiving oxygen.
And that's a change that starts immediately someone dies and is present in the hands and the feet at about 4 hours and spreads the whole of the muscle mass of the body at about 12 hours.
Here they were posed with the problem.
This body was quite severely decomposed. In fact, the body was so severely decomposed, the crime scene investigators couldn't work out if it was a man or a woman. Now, to make an identification, you need to compare records that were made before death with those that were discovered at the autopsy. We know the body was found in the home of Stevie Allman, but who was she?
Stevie Allman was very kind, very giving person, and wanted to do good for mankind, for her neighborhood, for the people that she loved and cared about.
Stevie lived with her sister in a small bungalow at 50th Avenue, Oakland, California, where she grew up. She came from a big family with 10 brothers and sisters.
Most of the kids had already moved out of the house and were long gone and started their own families. Well, Stevie lived in this small white bungalow.
Stevie Allman was a hard-working woman, had a career. I think she was an accountant or some administrative position that she had earned a 20-year retirement from.
2 weeks before the body was found, a 911 call had come in from a neighbor saying there was a fire in Stevie Allman's home. When firefighters arrived at the scene, they rescued a woman at the front of the house.
So when firefighters arrived, they asked her what happened and, of course, what was her name. She identified herself as Stevie Allman, and she said that drug dealers had surrounded the house and had thrown fire bombs into the house. And that they were firebombing the house because they had been videotaping the drug dealers in the area.
She also said that she intended to hand this evidence in to the police. Stevie was taken to Alta Bates Medical Center for treatment of her injuries.
The Oakland Police Department put out a $50,000 reward, and that was later doubled by the governor of the state of California. And so there was a $100,000 reward for anyone who could give any information on the drug dealers who allegedly firebombed the house.
When we have a citizen of this type who gets out and fights for the peace of the community, then we need to all rally around her and this police department to solve this crime.
Stevie told investigators that on the night of the fire, while she was sitting in the living room, she heard a crash in the kitchen, followed by a 1-gallon-sized glass jar hitting the kitchen floor and breaking into pieces. That crash was followed immediately by glass jars being thrown into the living room, the bathroom, and the front bedroom.
I was called into this case. It was getting a lot of publicity from the media, politicians. You know, I thought everything was legitimate, that it was somebody who was doing something for the community.
Stevie claimed she was targeted because she was trying to catch local drug dealers.
So I thought there's good reason to investigate who's committing these crimes.
Having spent a week in hospital, Stevie issued a news statement. "I have no doubt they intended to murder me and burn the house down on top of me. Their warped minds thought the act would clear the way to do their dirty dealing, and at the same time scare everyone else along 50th Avenue and beyond into a submissive, terrified slave state."
Everyone was talking about was this family that had been firebombed because they were taping drug dealers. And as a result, there was an outpouring of public support for Stevie Allman, and donations began pouring in. The donations totaled $4,700. Several contractors offered to rebuild the Stevie Allman's home.
But while investigating the arson attack, Sergeant Gregory was beginning to feel Stevie's story wasn't adding up.
We kind of walked around the scene and things just didn't look right to me. I'm led to believe that dope dealers carrying large iced tea jars with gasoline in them had thrown them through the windows. Well, this is not the way you retaliate against somebody out in the streets of Oakland. For one, I would be worried if I was carrying that jar of gasoline that I'd be doused with some of that gasoline my own self. And it would take a minimum of 4 people to do this, because one would have to carry the jug, one would have to light it on fire. And we had 2 different locations. So you're talking 4 people minimum.
However, there was no evidence of anyone running from the house on the night of the fire.
They were iced tea fragment jars because you could see glass fragments on the ground. What I thought was suspicious from the very beginning was the fact that they were on the outside of the house. If they were thrown from outside of the house into the house through a window, the projectile would go through the window. Instead, these were on the outside of the house, meaning to me they came from inside out.
Forensic investigations concluded the same thing, that the fire had most likely been intentionally set with a flammable liquid from inside the property.
We did a complete canvass of the neighborhood that day, and very little information was developed. One of the things that myself and other officers did, ask neighbors, "You're aware of the dope dealing going on?" "Yes, of course." "Were you aware that she was videotaping these dope dealers?" "No, not so much." But there wasn't really feeling on the neighbor's part that she was being targeted by any of the dope dealers. We had gone through probably a week of interviewing drug dealers, prostitutes, neighborhood people, and it just wasn't coming together. Dope dealers had told me, the hardcore dope dealers had actually told me in an interview, if she was that much of a problem to us, we wouldn't use fire and gasoline, we'd just put a bullet in her head. Which, to me, that's the way problems were dealt with out there on the street.
Further investigations revealed that only 2 weeks earlier, there had been another fire when firefighters had been called to Stevie's bungalow.
Fire department, what's your emergency? There's a fire at 2171 50th Avenue. What's on fire? My house. Your house, we're on our way, ma'am.
But investigators weren't getting closer to finding out who was starting them.
Even after my canvass, talking to all the other investigators that interviewed people in the jail, I had nothing to substantiate that there was anybody else burning them out. There was, oh yeah, I heard that she was being burned out, by dope dealers, but they're hearing this third hand, from somebody else. Nothing to substantiate any of that.
The Oakland Police Department had not received one tip as a result of that reward money that was put out there. And, you know, the reality is in Oakland, most of the people will turn their grandmother in for $100. Whereas in this case, they had a $100,000 reward out there, and that was very unusual in Oakland, to not receive not one tip with that kind of money being out there. It was clear to many of them that there was something strange going on in this case.
Stevie's accounts of the fires just weren't adding up.
Things like this that are just so bizarre and out of the norm. This is what horror movies are made out of.
On the 15th of July 1997, a dismembered body was found in the freezer of Stevie Allman's home in Oakland, California. Who was the victim and what secrets could the body reveal? 2 weeks earlier, a woman identifying herself as Stevie had suffered horrific injuries after her home was firebombed.
Although badly burned, she survived, and she was showered with support and money by local public and politicians after she said she'd been targeted by drug dealers. But it wasn't long before detectives became suspicious and wondered how much of her story was actually true.
When Stevie was injured in the firebombing, it was all over the local news.
One thing that was brought to the attention was that when the news media took photographs of Stevie being put into an ambulance and sent up to the hospital, word got back to me that that wasn't Stevie at all.
Stevie's older sister, Leota Belleville, told police that the injured woman was actually Sarah Mitchell, another sister who lived with Stevie.
Stevie was never married. Stevie never belonged to the PTA, and Stevie would never have filmed drug dealers.
And she made it very adamant to me that that was Sarah that was put into the ambulance, not Stevie.
Stevie was always what you would call a homebody. Stevie would just go to work and then come home. He was a very private person. If she wasn't at work, then Stevie was at home. And so it was very unusual for the house to have suffered this fire damage and for Stevie to not be present after several days. And family members began asking, where is Stevie?
Leota called her sister Sarah to see if she knew where the other sister Stevie was.
And the first time she asked her the question, she said she's in Reno. Well, a little bit later in the conversation, the sister asked her again, well, where is Stevie? And when she answered the second time, she said, I told you she's in Lake Tahoe. Leota said, well, wait a minute. The first time you told me that she was in Reno, and now you just told me that she's in Lake Tahoe. So what is it?
Leota then immediately filed a missing persons report.
Then it's time to call out all the stops and bring Sarah or Stevie into the office to interview them to find out who in fact they are. I wasn't able to get a hold of her at the hospital because she was confined to the burn unit, and the burn unit has to stay very antiseptic.
Over a week later, the injured woman was released from hospital, and officers located her at a hotel in Alameda and brought her in for interview.
So I wanted to know who I was speaking to, because even during our interview, I was referring to her as Stevie.
People will call me Sarah. People will call me Stevie, Miss Allman.
You're not Sarah?
No, I'm Stevie.
Okay, all right.
I had my suspicions about the fire. She had frontal burns, which told me that she was in front of the fire. She had a full head of hair, but The hair wasn't burned, nothing on her back. She had burns, all frontal burns, which is unusual because to get frontal burns, you're not running through the house screaming as it follows you out the house. You're in front of the fire as opposed to being behind you. That makes sense.
Still assuming she was Stevie, he wanted to know where her sister Sarah was.
And then when questioning her about the whereabouts of Sarah, she said, oh, nonchalantly, very cavalier, she's off in Reno with her boyfriend. It was like, when's the last time you talked to her? Oh, I don't know, a few days ago, maybe a week ago. That just seemed totally out of the realm of being realistic to me.
So Sarah had told her family that Stevie was in Reno, and this woman claiming to be Stevie was now telling the police that Sarah was in Reno.
She had multiple identifications on her. I mean, she had Stevie's identification on her and Sarah's. You know what I'm thinking? If Sarah is off in Nevada, what are you doing with Sarah's identification?
They found in her purse a check made out to Stevie Allman by the Alpha Bates Hospital for $2,744.
So she's got a lot of money on her in her purse. Where did you get the money, Stevie? Well, I got this from donations while I was in the hospital from people to get by.
Still unsure as to whether she was Stevie or Sarah, Gregory decided to take fingerprints to confirm her identity.
And luckily for us, Sarah had a prior criminal record. Very minor. She had been arrested for prostitution for quite a few years before that. But the fingerprints did come back and confirmed that the person that we rolled were that of belonging to Sarah.
It was now clear that it was Sarah Mitchell, not Stevie Allman, who had been burned in the fire. Sarah was pretending to be her sister Stevie. She had Stevie's ID on her and had a large check made out to Stevie on her person.
At that point, we arrested Sarah for forgeries.
If she had lied about her identity, what else had she lied about?
My suspicion was that Stevie was dead somewhere. My feeling was that she would be at the house. The search warrant was prepared, and we were told to put it on hold the next day. I had a friend of mine bring a cadaver dog from San Mateo County. It sniffs and smells blood, body tissue.
Whilst waiting for the search warrant to come through, the cadaver dog was outside the property when nature called.
He ultimately let his dog relieve itself in the backyard, and the dog promptly went right to a skill saw blade. The dog started licking the skill saw blade. That told me that there was blood residue on the skill saw blade. So that told me that we were on the right path right there. Later on, other homicide detectives and myself went ahead and served the search warrant on the house.
A week after Sarah's true identity was revealed, the dismembered body was discovered in the freezer at the home of Stevie Allman.
Police were now sure that two women lived in the house. They were Stevie Allman, age 52, and her sister, Sarah Mitchell, age 47. And they looked very similar, the same body shape, the same height, the same appearance. So much so that neighbors sometimes thought that they were twins. And that's what made identification even more important. 3 ways of identifying a body were present. First, we'd use now was DNA, but it's still in its infancy then and probably wasn't used. The second was fingerprints. They can be really valuable only if somebody has a criminal record and their fingerprints are stored by the police. But fingerprints can be lost through decomposition and so not be reliable. Finally, there are the dental records, but only if somebody has dental records that are available for comparison. So when we look at this lady on the digital autopsy table, we can see she's got the changes in her mouth that are really important for a dental identification. Loss of teeth in the upper jaw, but marks of where the teeth have been. Scant teeth in the lower jaw with evidence of dental work. And this is what's important in making a positive dental identification.
The dental records proved the body in the freezer was Stevie Allman.
Why was her sister pretending to be Stevie? And why would anyone want Stevie Allman dead?
In California, police were dealing with a strange case of confused identities,
They had a dismembered body.
which had been clearly identified as Stevie Allman, but they also had a very much alive woman
Who was insisting that she was Stevie Allman, even though her fingerprints had identified her as Stevie's sister, Sarah Mitchell. When the body was discovered at the home of the sisters, police moved in on Sarah.
And it was at that point Sarah Mitchell was charged with the murder of her sister. But there was still a lot of investigation that needed to be done, because at this point, it was a completely circumstantial evidence case.
To try and uncover the truth, investigators wanted to find out more about the sisters.
It was Stevie, Sarah, and the mother that lived in the house. When the mother passed, it was just Stevie and Sarah that lived in the house. Both of them were very similar, probably in height. I would say not tall women, 5'6", 5'7", maybe. And within a few years of each other, they tend to comb their hair the same way, straight back a lot of times. To me, they could be very well twins.
Despite looking alike, they were said to have very different personalities.
Stevie Allman was very hardworking, very industrious, the kind of person who always had a job and was always a provider for her family.
Stevie had a retirement. She was responsible. She was maintaining the upkeep of the house. She was doing everything she could to be a good person in the neighborhood like that.
Whereas Sarah, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. Some would even go as far as to say Sarah was absolutely lazy, never wanted to work. She always was looking for someone else to take care of her.
It's my understanding that Sarah had just been kind of living there rent-free, just taken and taken and taken.
Sarah had gone through her share of boyfriends. She was addicted to prescription medication and was always trying to get over on somebody, you know, rather than earn a living herself and do the right thing.
Stevie thought that, you know, it was time for Sarah to be a responsible adult, take care of herself, go get a job, and that she wasn't willing to carry the load for Sarah.
I would describe Stevie and Sarah, the good sister and the bad sister, really.
But was Sarah really bad enough to kill her own sister? When the dismembered body was recovered, it was hoped that it would be able to reveal the truth about its murder at autopsy.
If the murderer was trying to hide the evidence by starting the fire, they'd failed because the body was protected within the freezer. And so the whole of Stevie Allman's body was available for autopsy. And when they looked at the head, they found areas of over 20 separate injuries. On the skin, many of them had a tram line or rail track appearance, 2 parallel lines of bruising consistent with a linear object. Internally, when they looked, there were extensive fractures to the face and also to the skull. So fractures of the cheekbone, of the jaw, of the forehead, of the skull, all over. But more importantly, there was evidence of hemorrhaging around the brain. And the hemorrhaging would have occurred inside the skull, around the fractures, but also on and within the brain. And that would have been the cause of death. The pathologist couldn't be certain as to the weapon used, but he said that it was elongated with a hard edge, like a metal bar.
Well, it appeared that the body had major trauma to the head, so we were asked to go back to the scene and see what we could find. I didn't know if I was looking for a hammer, a crowbar, a pipe. We just didn't know. So I was collecting a lot of possibilities that may have had some blood or hair transfer on it.
The investigators were also looking for evidence of how and where the body had been dismembered.
I know the crime lab recovered the trap in the bathroom tub. Blood gets washed down. There's always some type of residue of blood that's left, and you can use what they call a luminol, which is a liquid or spray that can spray it on there, use a black light, and it'll just pop right up. We were able to also discover some cut marks in the bathtub. I recovered saws and knives and blades and a crowbar and hammers and like tools on the back porch area as well. Crime lab established that she was killed in her bedroom, possibly in her bed while she was sleeping. And then the body was moved from that room into the bathroom where her body was dismembered.
A neighbor told police they saw Stevie and Sarah together in their backyard on the 15th of June, 4 days before the first fire. This was the last time Stevie Allman was seen alive. Could the body help them establish a time of death?
Estimating the time of death in a decomposing body can be a real challenge, but it's especially complicated where the body was initially frozen and only started to decompose when the freezer stopped working after the second fire. Estimations suggest that Stevie had been dead for around a month, and that fits quite well with her being seen on the 15th of June.
There was nothing to suggest why Sarah Mitchell would want to kill her sister Stevie Allman, so investigators looked into her financial situation to see if that would provide any clues.
What we found was that every one of her accounts had been emptied. Sarah Mitchell had cleaned out her bank accounts, her mutual funds, her retirement account, and had withdrawn all of the money. And for every transaction, there's a photograph or a video of the transaction. On every transaction, there was Sarah Mitchell disguised as her sister and using her sister's ID to obtain monies from her sister's accounts. We had one of the top forensic handwriting experts in the United States, Lloyd Cunningham, and confirmed that the signatures that Sarah Mitchell signed in the name of Stevie Allman were forged signatures by Sarah Mitchell.
By assuming that Stevie's identity, the checks would be coming in to Stevie. All the good things that Stevie did, Sarah was mooching off of that. I mean, that's just total greed.
But Sarah didn't stop at emptying Stevie's bank accounts. Only 24 hours before the second fire, she received a visit from an insurance adjuster.
I believe it was the next day that she burned the whole house down. And that if she burned the whole house down, she could also get the insurance proceeds for the home. And we think that that was the motive for her burning the whole house down. You know, this case took so many bizarre twists that it was crazy.
Police had been investigating the murder of Stevie Allman, whose body had been dismembered and put in the chest freezer in her home. They discovered that her sister, Sarah Mitchell, had stolen her identity and was stealing her money. Yet Sarah continued to maintain her innocence.
Despite this, police had charged Sarah Mitchell with the murder of her sister Stevie Allman. But now they had to build the case. Could the body give any more clues? The body had revealed that Stevie Allman was killed by blows to the head using an elongated instrument with a hard edge that caused hemorrhaging inside the skull.
And the body had also been dismembered. Dismemberment murders are quite rare. It also adds a huge psychological overlay to the type of person who would commit that murder and then go on to cut up a human body.
I can show you where the body had been cut apart.
First cut was through the knees, and the lower legs were missing. The second cut had been through the waist.
And both arms had also been cut off.
I think the murderer stopped at this point because she got the body small enough to fit into the freezer, which was only 4 foot long. The one thing in the investigators' favour was that all parts of the body were present. Now, I know from personal experience that dismembering a body can be a really difficult task, even for someone with specialist skills. But in this case, evidence from the body showed that the person had struggled to cut through all of the joints, and it became clear that she must have used a saw to cut through many of the bones. This must have been a terrible end.
The forensic pathologist took photos of the areas where the cuts were made. You could tell by the smooth cuts that it was done with an electric saw. Because if it was a handheld saw, you would have a more jagged cut. And then it was consistent with an electric skill saw because there was blood everywhere in the room. There was blood spatter on all 4 walls of the bedroom, and that she was unable to clean all of the blood evidence. So rather than clean all the blood off of the walls, she lit the room on fire. There was no evidence of anyone breaking into the house. Even when they did the arson investigation, it was determined that the fire bombs were consistent with having been ignited from inside the house because there was no broken glass inside the house indicating that any kind of firebomb had been thrown through a window.
Investigators now believe Sarah staged the fire to conceal the murder, and the burns on her body were splash burns, which can happen to an arsonist when they set a fire. And they discovered she had stolen Stevie's identity even before she had killed her.
We found evidence of her engaged in financial theft from Stevie's accounts even before the murder and the firebombing. And we also did think that that was part of why she also killed her sister, because there had been previous incidents of theft from Stevie's accounts. And Stevie had also warned her that if there was a repeat incident of her stealing from Stevie, that Stevie was going to throw her out of the house. So I think that once Stevie Allman made that demand that Sarah would need to go out and get a job and really take care of herself, I think began the breakdown of the relationship between Sarah Mitchell and Stevie Allman. And it was at some time during that period that Sarah Mitchell determined that she was going to kill Stevie Allman and assume her identity and take all of her assets. And then we found several checks that had been fraudulently cashed on Stevie's account prior to the murder. So that was where we eventually concluded that the motive for this whole case was financial gain.
In November 2000, Sarah Mitchell faced trial at Alameda County Superior Court for the murder of her sister, Stevie Allman.
Sarah had 2 attorneys, and these guys were top-notch. They were outstanding defense attorneys. But, you know, good representation doesn't change the fact that the evidence of her guilt was overwhelming, despite it being only circumstantial evidence. And so, you know, during the trial, you know, she would smile some days, and some days she wouldn't smile because she's heard evidence of just the brutality of her crime, the cruelty of it. Those were hard days even for her to deal with.
After a 3-week trial, the jury delivered their verdict. Sarah Mitchell was convicted of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of intentional murder carried out for financial gain. The special circumstance clause made her eligible to die by means of a lethal injection.
In America, the jury's verdict has to be unanimous. So there are 12 jurors. If one juror votes not guilty, then the person is not convicted. And in this case, it was all 12. All 12 people indicated that Sarah Mitchell is guilty of murder. I looked over at Sarah Mitchell and I saw absolute relief on her face. You would think if you've just been convicted of a special circumstance murder that the person would be upset. Instead, what we saw on her face was absolute relief that the trial was over. And it was at that point that both myself and later we found out that for many of the jurors, that when they saw her expression after the verdict was read, everyone in the courtroom knew that she was guilty.
They were going to give her the death penalty, but one of her other sisters did not want to pursue the death penalty. They'd already suffered a big enough loss. They asked the district attorney, Terry Wiley, to ask for a life sentence for her, which is probably better in the end. Make her suffer a little bit, you know?
Sarah Mitchell was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
At the end of the day, Stevie's not coming back. And neither is Sarah. So I suppose justice was served.
Never had a case with a more depraved heart than Sarah Mitchell had. I mean, it was just a depraved heart.
It was very complex because you have the 2 sisters that look so much alike: money, greed, jealousy, and evil. This woman was evil. She wanted everything she couldn't have. So she just thought, I guess she'd take it from her sister.
I mean, who could do that to a sister, to a blood relative, to any person for that matter, but to a sister that you've grown up with your entire life? I can't even imagine it at all.
You know, this case was all about greed, and one sister feeling entitled to be taken care of for the rest of her life by her sister. And as soon as the sister indicated that she was not willing to do that, she murdered her. And she tried to take her money, and she tried to erase her sister from the face of the earth. And it just showed someone who had an absolute lack of character. I was glad that we were able to give the family some sense of justice, because although they did not want her to get the death penalty, they did want her punished for what she did to a very valuable member of their family.
Sarah Mitchell had gone to extreme lengths to try and hide the murder of her sister, Stevie Allman. She'd dismembered the body and hidden it in the freezer at their home.
And then committed arson on the home twice to try and get rid of the body.
But bodies never lie, and by literally piecing Stevie back together, the truth behind her murder was revealed.